In 1820, if you were born black in the state of Virginia, the first document ever created in your name would not be a birth certificate. It would be an entry in your enslaver's property ledger. You would be assigned a dollar value before you could walk, and the person who held that ledger had the full backing of American law to sell you before you were old enough to remember your own mother's face. Most people assume they understand what life looked like for Black Americans born in the 19th century. They have seen the museum exhibits, the memorial plaques, the carefully selected photographs that appear in school textbooks. But what historians, archivists, and documentary scholars have actually uncovered about what it meant to be born black in 19th century America is darker, more precisely engineered, and more deliberately sustained across generations than anything most classrooms have ever fully confronted. Start at the beginning, at birth itself. Historian Daina Ramey, in her landmark study, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, documented how enslaved people were assigned monetary values at every stage of their lives, from infancy onward, tracking the precise ways that American slavery calculated human beings not as people, but as appreciating or depreciating assets. A newborn baby had a value. That value was recorded, and it was adjusted like livestock prices, depending on the child's apparent health and physical development in the weeks after birth. Plantation records studied by Berry and other scholars show that enslaved infants were often inspected and appraised within days of delivery, in the same matter-of-fact accounting language used for corn yields and tobacco harvests. Born black in the antebellum South meant entering a system that had spent 2 centuries perfecting the bureaucratic machinery of treating human life as capital. The domestic slave trade was the engine that made this machinery run. After 1808, when the international importation of enslaved Africans was officially banned, the supply of enslaved labor increasingly came from American-born children. The Upper South states, Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, became what historians describe as a primary source for the cotton and sugar plantations expanding rapidly across the Deep South. Edward Baptist, whose book The Half Has Never Been Told, reframed how historians understand slavery's central role in building American capitalism, traced how the forced migration of roughly 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Lower South between 1790 and 1860 systematically tore apart black families at a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. A child born in Virginia in 1830 faced a statistically significant chance of being sold away from their parents before they reached adulthood, not as a byproduct of the system, as one of its primary economic functions. What did the actual daily texture of this life look like? It depended enormously on geography and circumstance, as historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers has shown in her research on slavery across different southern states and economic contexts. An enslaved child on a small Virginia tobacco farm experienced something different from an enslaved child on a Louisiana sugar plantation, where conditions were so brutal that life expectancy for newly arrived workers was sometimes measured in years rather than decades. But certain realities cut across every setting. Work began early, far earlier than most people imagine. Children as young as 4 or 5 years old were put to tasks carrying water, fanning flies, minding younger infants so that their mothers could return to field labor faster. By 8 or 10, children were folded into the full labor force. The idea of childhood as a protected developmental stage, a concept only just beginning to emerge in white middle-class American culture during this same period, did not extend across the color line. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in most southern states. Learning to write could be punished violently. The deliberate maintenance of illiteracy was not incidental. It was a structural feature designed to limit options and limit the ability to contest one's own condition through legal or written means. Families were the hidden center of this story. Despite everything stacked against them, enslaved black families built profound bonds of love, community, and mutual care. They created naming traditions, oral histories, religious practices, and healing knowledge that survived across generations under conditions designed to erase them entirely. Historian Heather Andrea Williams, whose research on black family separation and the agonizing efforts of separated families to find each other after emancipation, appears in her book, Help Me to Find My People, documented how enslaved parents and children placed desperate advertisements in newspapers after the Civil War, searching for relatives sold away from them years or even decades earlier. One advertisement from 1865, reprinted in Williams's work, reads simply, "Information wanted of my mother, who was sold from me in Richmond, Virginia in 1853. I was then about 5 years old. These advertisements ran for years after emancipation. Some people searched for their entire lives and never found the people they were looking for. The separation had been too complete, the records too deliberately obscured. The Civil War ended legal slavery in 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished the institution, and for a brief, extraordinary period known as Reconstruction, roughly from 1865 to 1877, Black Americans entered political and civic life at a scale that is still startling to encounter in the historical record. Black men voted. Black men held office as state legislators, as congressmen, as senators. Schools were built. Black families purchased land. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established to assist formerly enslaved people through the transition to freedom, helped with labor contracts, legal disputes, and family reunification across the South. For one extraordinary decade, the democratic promise of the country was closer to being realized, imperfectly and incompletely, but visibly, than it had ever been in American history. Then it was dismantled, systematically, deliberately, with violence. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, the withdrawal of federal troops from the South left Black communities exposed to a wave of retaliatory legislation and organized terror that historians now recognize as a second system of racial control, constructed specifically to restore as much of slavery's economic logic as possible without technically violating the 13th Amendment. Black codes, later hardening into what became known as Jim Crow laws, regulated where Black people could live, work, travel, eat, sit, and worship. Convict leasing, documented extensively by historian Douglas Blackmon in Slavery by Another Name, turned minor criminal charges, loitering, vagrancy, failing to carry proof of employment, into sentences of forced labor. Men were arrested for walking down the wrong road and leased to coal mines and railroad companies for years at a time. The 13th Amendment had contained an exception clause. Slavery was abolished except as punishment for crime. That exception became a door, and the new system walked straight through it. And then there was the terror. Between 1877 and 1950, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, documented over 4,000 racial terror lynchings of Black Americans in the South alone, a number compiled through painstaking archival research conducted across many years by Bryan Stevenson and his colleagues. These were not spontaneous outbursts of mob violence. They were often scheduled in advance, advertised in local newspapers, attended by crowds that brought their children along. They were mechanisms of social control designed to enforce a racial hierarchy through fear, and they functioned precisely because local law enforcement either participated or looked the other way. A Black man born in Mississippi in 1870, technically free, technically a citizen, reached adulthood inside a landscape where being visibly successful, being visibly educated, being visibly too comfortable with the rights the Constitution said were his could be enough to mark him as a target. What kept Black communities alive through all of this was not simply endurance. It was active, organized, collective survival. The Black church became the institutional backbone of community life across the South, a space that white authority could not easily invade without attracting the kind of scrutiny that even a segregated America occasionally applied. Black schools, Black newspapers, Black mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations, Black entrepreneurial networks that circulated money deliberately within communities to resist economic strangulation. All of these were built, maintained, and fiercely protected by people who understood perfectly well what they were up against and built something anyway. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, described the experience of living behind what he called the veil, the invisible barrier separating Black American life from white American life, not as a metaphor, but as a precise structural reality he had watched being built brick by brick across his own lifetime. What does any of this still have to do with today? More than is comfortable to acknowledge. The specific ways that systemic disadvantage was constructed across the 19th century through deliberate exclusion from land ownership, from legal protection, from education, from the ability to accumulate and pass down wealth across generations, did not vanish when the laws enforcing it were eventually repealed. When sociologist Thomas Shapiro at Brandeis University studied intergenerational wealth transfer across American families, he found that inherited assets, savings, property, and social networks compounded across generations in ways that made a century of organized exclusion almost mathematically impossible to fully reverse within just a few decades of nominal legal equality. The families who were legally barred from accumulating, owning, and passing on wealth from 1619 through 1865, and then subjected to targeted theft and destruction of what little they had built in the decades after, began the 20th century at a structural starting position that the 20th century's own legal barriers then continued to compound. The 19th century is not as distant as it feels, as historians continue to open Freedmen's Bureau records, plantation inventories, and the personal testimonies of those who survived and bore witness to this era. Our understanding of exactly how this system worked and how precisely its effects continue to ripple forward in time continues to be revised. Any honest account of this history has to hold its conclusions with humility, the way the best scholars always do, with full awareness that new archival discoveries continue to sharpen and sometimes complicate the picture we thought we had. What doesn't change is the weight of the evidence itself. So when people think of what it meant to be born Black in 19th century America, they tend to imagine a single dramatic moment, a plantation scene from a film, a famous name in a textbook. But the reality was a system, constructed over generations, sustained by law, by commerce, by organized violence, and by the quiet complicity of an enormous number of ordinary people who benefited from it and preferred not to look too directly at the machinery. And that system began at the very first breath. Because the first document ever made in your name was not a birth certificate, it was a price. And prices, once set deep enough into the foundation of a society, take far longer to fully erase than most people want to believe.